My wife and I have been together for a very long time, and, as often happens in long-term relationships, we've had both good and bad times. We've argued, sometimes drifted apart, but then came back together again. Nothing too dramatic, but over time, things can become boring. Sometimes it was just the routine, work, bills, stuff like that. Other times, it felt like a coldness settled between us, and neither of us wanted to admit it was happening. And honestly, sometimes we didn't even try to fix it. But in those moments when it felt like everything was about to fall apart, we had a rather strange solution. Open relationships. Yes, I understand how that sounds. And no, it wasn't just permission to sleep with whoever. We didn't do this often. In fact, it was more of a last resort, something like a final option when it seemed like nothing else was working. We agreed that if we ever felt like our relationship was on the edge, we would open it up. But there were certain rules. The first rule, no friends or relatives. That was a strict boundary. We couldn't involve anyone we personally knew. Second, no relationships with multiple partners at the same time. And lastly, we could only sleep with someone once. Everything had to stay distant. The idea was to avoid any real emotional attachments. Just release the pressure, hit the reset button, and then come back to each other. This time, it all started because of me. I work as a cop, and suddenly, there was an opportunity for a big promotion. But with that opportunity came crazy work hours and a huge amount of tasks like patrolling neighborhoods or working with paperwork and documents. I'd come home completely exhausted, barely able to speak, let alone be a good partner. The promotion was all I could think about, and my wife and I just drifted apart. I could see it happening, like watching everything go off the rails, but I was too far away to do anything. She tried to talk, but I'd just grunt something in response. I was ashamed, but at that time, I didn't know how to handle it. And so, when our relationship reached the point where we were like roommates, we both knew what was coming next. We'd been through this before, and it had always helped, at least until the problem was resolved. After setting up a cozy evening with some relaxing music and a bottle of red wine, we sat down and discussed the rules again, the same ones we always had. It wasn't about emotions or finding someone to replace what we had. It was a temporary solution, a break to help us get back to what we needed. And so, after discussing all the details in a relaxed atmosphere, we went to bed, knowing that the next day would not just be a new day, but the start of a new month of our unusual experiment with the relationship. In the first few days, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Neither of us was in a rush to find someone on dating sites. I was busy with work, and my wife had her hands full with house chores, so there wasn't much time for anything else. But that was only temporary. After a few days, my wife finally found herself a man. He was also in an open relationship and was looking for something short-term. He had his own logistics business, a wife, and 2 kids. He was tall, lean, and charismatic, like a Hollywood actor. Don't be surprised that I'm describing him in such detail. This information will come in handy later. Meanwhile, I decided not to fall behind my wife and found myself a girl as well. Finally, after what felt like forever, I had a day off and set up a date at my favorite Italian restaurant, which is located in the center of our town, Bakersfield. When we met, she turned out to be younger than I expected and incredibly charismatic. Even then, I felt like she didn't care for all the preliminaries, like sitting in a restaurant or getting to know each other over a bottle of wine. Her tight dress, with some rib parts, hinted that she was ready to jump into bed right away. And as it turned out, I wasn't wrong. Without even finishing dinner, but already quite drunk, she practically said outright that it was time to head to the hotel. Another important detail, this girl came from a large family. She had 6 siblings, and 4 of them were girls, including her. Keep that in mind, as it'll be important later. After paying the bill, we left the restaurant and headed to the nearest hotel, which was just 300 meters away. But things didn't go as expected. Despite being drunk, I didn't want to leave my car. I thought for a few minutes about what to do, but the girl kept encouraging me. She clearly didn't want to wait. Her look said that she wasn't willing to waste another minute. She leaned in closer and said, "Let's just take the car." I didn't want to deny such a beautiful girl her request, so I agreed. We got into the car, and we hadn't even driven off when she asked me to turn into a nearby alley. That threw me off a bit as a cop, but I decided not to refuse. We turned into the alley. I turned off the engine, and she immediately, wasting no time, started kissing me and taking off my clothes. "I can't hold back any longer," she said. And before I realized what was happening, she was already unbuttoning my shirt. Her pace was so fast that I stopped thinking about the hotel. She clearly wanted me right here, right now, and I wasn't about to resist. I helped her out of her luxurious dress, and soon we were completely lost in each other. I drive a Chevrolet Tahoe, and trust me, that thing is huge, practically a room on wheels. So when it came to comfort, we weren't lacking at all. We spent the whole night in the car, making love with such intensity that the car was shaking as if it was driving over potholes. It was one of the wildest nights of my life, maybe even the best. When I woke up in the morning, I had a strange feeling, a mix of satisfaction and regret. Part of me wanted to relive that night, but something inside me stopped that thought. I woke her up and told her I had to go to work. She looked a little disappointed, but didn't insist. I drove her home, and just before she got out of the car, she kissed me passionately again, as if hoping this was just the beginning. But I knew better. Or at least, I thought I did. I wasn't planning on seeing her again. I thought it was a one-time thing, like we had agreed. I had my fun, but didn't want it to turn into something more. I drove away, thinking it was over. But I was wrong. A few days passed. My wife seemed really into the guy she'd found. She was discreet, not talking much about it, but I could tell she was enjoying it. She would mention him in passing, talking about how they went out for drinks or discussed their marriages. I didn't ask too many questions, and didn't want to. We had rules, and as long as she followed them, I was ready to turn a blind eye to the fact that she was just spending her free time with him in some establishments and only made love once, just like I had. Time passed, and as I mentioned earlier, my wife continued to see that same guy she had found. Meanwhile, that one night in the car was more than enough for me. The girl kept texting me, but I always found excuses. I was either too busy with work or had something else going on. I just wasn't interested in going down that path again. A week went by, and I had a rare day off. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, that it was risky after such a passionate night, but I told myself I could keep things under control. I wasn't planning on anything happening, just a simple meeting. So, I agreed to go on another date with her. I didn't really have time to look for someone new, and frankly, I didn't want to spend my day off sitting in front of the TV with a beer while my wife was out having her own fun. This time, we kept things low-key and decided to take a walk in the local park. When we met, I gave her a quick kiss, but it didn't go beyond that. We spent the afternoon strolling around, sipping coffee, and just talking. But I could tell she had something else on her mind. She kept making little hints about repeating what happened in the car. For example, she'd say things like, "Maybe we could take a ride around the city." But I kept brushing it off, telling her I just wanted to enjoy the fresh air and the scenery. As the sun began to set, we found a bench and sat down to watch it. I could tell she was getting a little frustrated, realizing that our time together was coming to an end, and we hadn't gotten physical. That's when she started being more direct. She touched me in ways that made it clear what she wanted, even slipping her hand under my clothes. It wasn't subtle anymore. And here's the thing. I could have given in. I mean, the temptation was there. But in that moment, something clicked, and I told her straight up that I didn't want to go there tonight. She looked a little hurt and disappointed, but she didn't push it. After the walk, I drove her home, and she gave me one last kiss before getting out of the car. Now, here's where things took a turn I wasn't expecting. When I got home that evening, I was prepared to tell my wife about the walk, maybe even spin it in a way that'd make her feel better. I assumed she wouldn't be too concerned that I hadn't gotten physical with the girl. If anything, it'd probably work in her favor. But I was wrong. As I pulled up near our house, I noticed a car parked in the driveway, a familiar Range Rover. It didn't take long to realize who it belonged to. It was my wife's friend's car. You know, the one, tall, charming, with that whole Hollywood actor vibe. The guy she'd been seeing during our open relationship period. But why was he here so late at night? He'd never been to our house before. Or at least, I thought he hadn't. The moment I stepped inside, I saw something that immediately made me tense up. There were several pairs of men's shoes scattered near the door. My gut twisted. I knew something wasn't right. I didn't even hesitate. I went straight to the bedroom, and what I saw there was worse than anything I had imagined. My wife was in bed with that same friend of hers. But it wasn't just him. There were two other men, his friends apparently, all tangled up with her. I froze for a second, my heart pounding in my chest. She was supposed to be seeing just one guy, right? That was the deal. That was the rule. Seeing me, my wife started crying, launching into a full-blown tantrum. She was screaming, trying to apologize, but it all sounded like noise to me. Her so-called friends weren't as emotional. They immediately scrambled out of bed, threw on whatever clothes they could find, and without even a second glance, they bolted. Instead of running through the front door, they jumped right out of the window. Lucky for them, we live on the first floor. At that moment, I could feel my blood boiling, but I didn't lose my head. I still had my service pistol with me, as I always do. While my wife was screaming for me to stop, I stormed outside just as the guys were piling into the Range Rover. Fueled by pure rage, I fired a couple of precise shots, hitting the wheels of their car. The tires deflated instantly, but somehow they managed to drive off, barely escaping on punctured tires. Afterward, I stood there for a moment, my heart still racing, before turning back to the house. My wife was sobbing, standing there half-dressed, begging me to listen to her, throwing out excuses and apologies. But I wasn't in the mood to hear it. Not after what I'd just seen. Without saying a word, I grabbed my jacket, took my car keys, and walked right past her. She tried to stop me, her voice breaking as she asked me where I was going, but I didn't even look at her. I was done listening to her lies. I got in my car and drove off, not knowing where I was headed, just knowing I needed to get away. Now, I don't know what comes next. Part of me wants to sit down and think things through, to figure out how everything went so wrong. But the other part of me is too angry, too hurt, to even consider forgiving her. I mean, how do you get past something like this? We had rules, clear rules, and she didn't just break them, she shattered them, and with multiple guys, no less. I thought the whole open relationship idea was supposed to help us, to relieve the tension, but now it feels like I've been played for a fool. So here I am, driving through the night, trying to make sense of everything. What do I do now? Do I go back and try to work things out? Or is this it? The end of everything? I stopped in a random parking lot on some street, not knowing where to go next. I was alone, with 1,000 thoughts racing through my mind. Who could I even turn to? My best friend had a house full of kids and a wife. Showing up there with news like this just wouldn't be appropriate. And going to my parents? That wasn't even an option. I didn't want to drop such heavy news on them right away. I sat in my car for a long time, just thinking, trying to figure out what to do next. And then, a desperate thought came to me. I grabbed my phone and called her. Yes, that same girl. The one I'd been avoiding, the one I'd seen in the park earlier today. I told her we needed to meet, and she immediately agreed, sounding almost too happy, like she'd been waiting for my call. She invited me over to her place, and I drove there without hesitation. When I arrived, she opened the door and instantly sensed that something was wrong. I must have looked awful, but she didn't ask any questions right away. Instead, she offered us some wine. That's when I started talking. I told her I was married, explained the whole open relationship situation. I told her about our rules and how my wife had broken them in the worst way, cheating on me with several men in our own home. She listened, her eyes wide with shock, but she was still understanding. She said that life throws things at us sometimes, and we just have to move on. She even apologized for being so forward in the park earlier, saying she hadn't realized what was going on in my life. It's not your fault, I said, trying to comfort her. I'm the fool here. And before I realized what I was doing, I gently took her by the neck and kissed her. It wasn't just a kiss. It was passionate, desperate, like I was trying to erase all the pain I had just gone through. That kiss turned into something more, and soon we were lost in each other, caught up in the moment. The night turned into a blur of wine and embraces, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I even wondered if we'd break her bed with how wild things had gotten. We drank bottle after bottle, the alcohol helping me forget everything for a while. The next morning, I woke up feeling a little disoriented but strangely at peace. The night had been hazy, but it was the distraction I so desperately needed. Instead of returning to reality, I called work and took another day off. I told myself I'd make it up later, but at that moment, I didn't care. We decided to head to my place to keep the fun going. My wife wasn't home, and honestly, I wasn't even thinking about her. All I wanted was to escape from my problems. The day turned into another wild experience. We didn't hold back, and by the time night fell, I was completely exhausted. But the next morning brought a new surprise. I woke up not only next to her, but also 3 other women. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but no, they were very real. It took me a second to process it, and then she started laughing. "These are my sisters," she said, clearly enjoying my confusion. I must have looked completely lost because she quickly added, "You don't remember? You were way too drunk last night." I had no idea what she was talking about. Apparently, in my drunken state, I had invited her sisters to join us. I was in shock, not knowing how to react to the fact that I had agreed to something like that. Before I could say anything, though, the bedroom door flew open. And there she was, my wife. She walked in and immediately started screaming, her voice rising to hysterics when she saw what was happening. The sisters jumped out of bed, blushing as they scrambled to gather their clothes. But me? I stayed calm. Strangely calm. Actually, I looked my wife straight in the eyes and reminded her of what had happened just 2 days ago. I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth spoke for itself. I told her to pack her things and leave the house. Her betrayal had destroyed everything between us, and now there was no going back. She didn't argue, quietly leaving the room to pack. The sisters slipped out just as quietly, clearly embarrassed by the whole situation. And then it was just me and her. I turned to her, still trying to piece together what had happened the night before. I apologized, saying it was my fault for getting so drunk and letting things spiral out of control. She apologized too, admitting it had been her idea to invite her sisters, but we both agreed that we hadn't been thinking clearly. In a strange way, that night brought closure to my relationship with my wife. Her betrayal had shattered everything we had. But in some odd twist of fate, I had accidentally gotten revenge without even realizing it, thanks to my new girlfriend. Now, we laugh about that night with her sisters, like it was some bizarre dream. It's a memory we've tucked away as one of those strange moments that just happens in life. Now, I live with her, and our relationship has grown deeper than either of us could have expected. We've moved past the chaos of the past, and I can honestly say I'm happier than I've ever been. She brings me joy, and I do the same for her. Whatever happens next, I know we're on the same page. Funny how life sometimes falls into place, isn't it? It can feel like everything's falling apart, and then someone comes along and changes it all.